I wasn't even 3 steps across the threshold when the air in the room curdled. My mother didn't bother standing up. She just looked up from a sagging folding table, narrowed her eyes into 2 spiteful slits and spat, "Didn't think you'd show your face after dropping out." Behind her, a cluster of my aunts let out these sharp, hushed chuckles, the kind of gossipy, jagged sound that makes you realize they'd been passing my failures around like appetizers before I even arrived. They'd been waiting for this. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a grimace. Instead, I flashed a small, curated smile, not the happy-to-be-home kind, but the don't-even-try-it kind, and beelined for the seat closest to the exit. In this family, you learn the exits before you learn the names of your cousins. You learn to read the room like a thermal map, and rule number 1 is simple: never let them see you flinch. I'm Noah. I'm 28, and until today, I hadn't set foot in this zip code for 3 years. It wasn't because I was finding myself in Bali or grinding at some high-rise office in London. I stayed away because I was done being the family's punching bag. My family treats tradition like a fundamentalist religion. If you don't have a degree, you're a pariah. If you take a risk, you're a cautionary tale. If you fail once, they look at you with that sickening "we told you so" pity, as if your downfall was written in the stars. Then there's Nathan, my older brother, the golden boy. Nathan was the straight-A student, the varsity captain, the finance bro who landed a Fortune 500 gig before he'd even tossed his graduation cap. He got the waterworks from mom and dad's vintage Rolex. I was the creative one, which, in my house, is code for unemployed dreamer. I wanted to build things, code systems, and tell stories, not rot in an Excel spreadsheet for 40 years. My parents tolerated my interests the way you tolerate a toddler bringing home a mangy stray cat. They were mildly amused but mostly just waiting for the day I'd grow up and get rid of it. I lasted 2 years in college. I wasn't failing, I was just dying inside. I felt this magnetic pull toward a world that was actually moving, while I was stuck in a lecture hall. So I walked. No dramatic exit, no bridge burning, just a quiet "I'm done" and a move to a cramped studio. I spent years in the trenches. Freelance web design, grueling coding sprints, and helping local businesses that were as broke as I was. Eventually, I funneled every ounce of caffeine-fueled desperation I had into a SaaS product. I had no safety net, no small loan from Dad. Just pure, unadulterated grit. And it worked. It more than worked. My company was recently featured in a top-tier tech journal, and 3 months ago, I quietly liquidated a 40% stake. The number on my bank statement has more zeros than anyone in that room could fathom. But to them, I'm still the dropout, the failure, the kid who couldn't hack it. When the invite to Nathan's engagement party arrived, it felt like a subpoena. It was handwritten by my mother. Vague, cold, and stripped of any "we miss you" sentiment. Just a time and a place. I stared at it for a week. Then, after a particularly toxic board meeting where I had to walk away from a predatory investor, I realized I was tired of hiding. Not because I needed their approval, but because I needed to see the ghost of my past and realize it couldn't hurt me anymore. The party was a masterpiece of budget luxe. We're talking cheap folding tables draped in itchy, glittery gold polyester, plastic champagne flutes that looked like they'd snap if you gripped them too hard, and a buffet line featuring lukewarm meatballs and a pasta salad that looked like it was sweating. It was a room desperately screaming that it was expensive while smelling faintly of floor wax and disappointment. The second I walked in, the ambient noise dropped 10 decibels. Necks craned. Whispers traveled like wildfire. My mom was perched at the center table like a high priestess, surrounded by her sisters and Nathan's future in-laws. That's when she went for the jugular with the "dropping out" comment. I let the insult slide off me like water off a Gore-Tex jacket. I just nodded, my expression unreadable. "Good to see you too, Mom," I said smoothly, pulling out a chair. Nobody offered me a plate. Nobody asked how I'd been. They just stared at the failure in the room, completely oblivious to the fact that the watch on my wrist cost more than the entire catering budget for the wedding they were so proud of. Would you like me to continue the story and describe the moment the family finds out about Noah's actual net worth during the toasts? No one in that room bothered to ask how I was doing. Not even Nathan, my own brother, the man of the hour. He just tossed a stiff, awkward half-nod my way from across the room, looking at me like I was some vaguely familiar face from a high school yearbook he'd rather keep closed. His fiancée, Leah, gave me a small wave. She'd always been the nice one, but even her kindness felt performative, like it was costing her social capital just to acknowledge my existence. It didn't take long for the vultures to start circling. The subtweeting in real life began almost immediately. Aunt Monica leaned over to my cousin Leah, not even bothering to lower her voice, and stage whispered, "He used to be so gifted. Remember? Such a tragic waste of potential." The table erupted in those tight, judgmental giggles. Uncle Rob, who thinks he's the family's resident financial guru because he owns a lawn care franchise, laughed a little too loudly at a joke about TikTok millionaires living in their mother's basements. Even my grandmother, the supposed matriarch of grace, gave me the icy glare she usually reserved for door-to-door proselytizers who interrupted her Sunday service. I kept my mouth shut. I didn't come here to play who's the biggest success. I wasn't there to justify my life choices or explain the sweat equity I'd poured into my career. I just sat there, a silent observer in the toxic ecosystem I'd escaped, reminding myself that I no longer needed their validation to breathe. But then, the script flipped. About an hour into the party, while the guests were milling around and pretending the DJ's top 40 Spotify playlist wasn't absolute bottom-tier trash, a tall guy in a crisp, expensive-looking blue dress shirt stepped up to the table to refill his drink. He caught my eye and gestured to the empty chair next to me. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. I shrugged, leaning back. "Be my guest." He extended a hand. "I'm Jake. I work with Nathan at the firm. I think we met once at the office Christmas party a few years back, but I was the new guy on the totem pole then." I shook his hand with a polite, neutral nod. "Noah." Jake's brow furrowed. He paused mid-sip, his eyes searching my face. "Wait, Noah. Noah Ellis." "Yeah," I said, keeping it clipped. He blinked, taking a slow, shaky breath. "As in, the lead investor behind Kinetic? The guy who founded and then partially exited the Ellis Group." The effect was instantaneous. It was like a physical shockwave hit the surrounding tables. My cousin Leah froze with her glass halfway to her lips. A fork clattered onto a ceramic plate somewhere to my left. Jake looked like he had just realized he was sitting next to a glitch in the Matrix. "Yeah," I said, my voice smooth and casual. "That's me." Jake's mouth hung open. He looked like he was trying to solve a complex algorithm in his head in real time. "Holy. I'm sorry, Nathan always talked about you like you were, off the grid. Doing your own thing. He never mentioned that you were the Noah Ellis." He cut himself off, looking genuinely embarrassed for my brother. The room went dead quiet. The kind of silence that rings in your ears. My mother's fork hovered inches from her mouth, her expression frozen in a mask of confusion. Nathan stood paralyzed in the middle of a conversation with Leia's father, his face draining of color as he felt every eye in the room pivot toward me. I just smiled, a real one this time, and adjusted my cuff. Funny how life works out, isn't it? In that heartbeat, I knew. The carefully constructed narrative they'd built over the last decade, the story where I was the dropout, the disappointment, the family charity case, was collapsing under the sheer weight of a reality they never saw coming. Their golden boy was suddenly standing in a very long shadow. But I didn't push it. Not yet. I just leaned back, folded my hands, and let the silence fester. The real show was only just beginning. Jake eventually stammered out a few polite pleasantries and beat a hasty retreat, looking at me like I was a ghost from the Forbes 30 Under 30 list. He left behind a vacuum of sound more deafening than the DJ's tragic attempt to mix Ed Sheeran into Drake. For a few beats, no one moved. Then, the whispers returned, but they were different now, sharp, frantic, passing through the crowd like a digital virus. My mother was the first to regain her composure. She set her fork down with a deliberate clink and dabbed her mouth with a paper napkin as if she were presiding over a gala at the Met and not a lukewarm buffet in a rented VFW hall. She cleared her throat, a sharp sound designed to reset the room's hierarchy. "Did you all hear that?" she said, her voice dripping with a new kind of condescension. She didn't look at me, she looked at her plate. "Our little dropout has become an investor now. Isn't that just something?" Aunt Monica let out a shrill, nervous laugh. "Well, there's always money to be found in those internet hobbies. For now, anyway. It's all very volatile, isn't it?" Uncle Rob snorted into his plastic cup. "Must be nice to just buy into a company with some lucky cash instead of building a real career from scratch, huh? Easy come, easy go." And just like that, the family machine started grinding again. They rewrote the story in real time to fit the version of the world where they were still superior. I wasn't a success, I was lucky. I wasn't a visionary, I was an opportunist. I was just some glorified crypto bro who'd stumbled into a pile of money and thrown a few coins at a startup. But as the night wore on, the polite dismissal started to sour. They couldn't just ignore the elephant in the room, they had to poke it. It was about to get personal, and they were about to find out that while I don't start fights, I'm very good at finishing them. Instead of acknowledging the truth that had just been dropped into the room like a live grenade, my family did what they do best. They smothered it under a thick, suffocating layer of sarcasm and backhanded praise. It was the kind of fake, attaboy, that comes with a serrated knife hidden behind the back. Later, during the inevitable and agonizing group photo session, my mother made a theatrical show of it. She grabbed Nathan by the shoulder, physically pulling him into the dead center of the frame, as if he were the sun and we were all just debris caught in his orbit. She looked directly at the photographer, her voice projecting to every corner of the hall. "Now, make sure you get this one right," she chirped with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This is the one who actually made us proud." She let out a little tinkling laugh to make it seem like a joke, but her eyes cut toward me, sharp and cold. "Make sure you get his good side. He's our big-shot CEO, after all." While the camera flashed, I felt a heavy hand shove my shoulder from behind. It was Uncle Rob. "Hey Noah, be a pal and grab us a round of drinks? You're tall. You can probably see over the line at the bar better than the rest of us." I looked at Nathan. He didn't even blink. He just kept his arm draped around Leia, flashing that practiced, pearly white, golden boy smile for the lens. He looked like he was born for the spotlight, while I wasn't even invited into the shot. I was the invisible man, the family errand boy. It was petty, the kind of high school BS they'd been pulling for a decade, but this time, the sting was different. I didn't want their approval. I'd long since realized that was a currency not worth holding. What I wanted was the truth. I'd taken the hits, I'd bled for my success, I'd built an empire from a laptop in a cockroach-infested studio, and they couldn't even muster the basic decency to acknowledge that I wasn't the failure they'd prayed I'd be. I retreated to the punch table, pulling out my phone and pretending to be buried in urgent emails just to create a digital barrier between me and the vultures. "Hey," a soft voice said. I looked up to see Leia standing there, looking genuinely uncomfortable. That was weird. "What your mom said." I shrugged, my face a mask of indifference. "Not really. It's a Saturday. That's just the standard operating procedure around here." Leia frowned, her brow knitting together. "No, Noah. It was wrong. I'm sorry. They shouldn't talk to you like that, especially not tonight." I gave her a tight nod. I appreciated the gesture. I really did, but a Band-Aid wasn't going to fix a sucking chest wound. This wasn't just about one snide comment at an engagement party. This was the script they'd been writing for me since I was 16 and dared to bring home a B+. It was the same story they told when I built my own rig instead of begging for a business internship, and when I spent my summers grinding on a startup instead of drinking overpriced wine at my cousin's Vermont wedding. I was the wrong mold, and Nathan was the perfect fit. That reality hit its peak when the speeches started. The DJ killed the music, and Uncle Rob, of course it was him, started clinking a fork against a plastic flute with enough drama to signal a royal coronation. The room crowded in, forming a tight circle around the happy couple. My mother stood up first. She always had to be the opening act. "I just want to say how incredibly proud we are," she began, her voice already wobbling with those practiced, cinematic tears. "Nathan has always been the heart of this family. He's always made us proud, from his first day of school to his career, and now starting this beautiful future with Leia." She paused, her voice cracking just enough to sell the emotion to the back row. "You're the kind of son any mother would be lucky to have." The room erupted in applause. I watched Nathan soak it up. He stood there basking in the adulation, one arm around Leia and the other tucked casually in his pocket, looking every bit the heir apparent. Then came the parade of platitude. Leia's mom, her maid of honor Aunt Monica, everyone had a cute story that reinforced the fairy tale. It was a narrative where Nathan was the prince and I was the cautionary tale mentioned in the footnotes. Then my dad stood up. That's when the last thread of my patience finally snapped. "My father isn't a man of warmth or feelings. He's built of cold logic and rigid, uncompromising expectations. His praise is like rain in a drought, rare, fleeting, and usually not enough to save the crop." When he raised his glass, the room went vacuum-sealed quiet. Even Nathan looked startled. "I don't say much," my dad started, his voice gravelly and stern. "But I want to say this. Nathan, you've made me proud in every way a father can be proud. You followed the path. You worked hard. You didn't take shortcuts." His eyes flickered to me for a fraction of a second, a cold, dismissive swipe. "You didn't run when things got difficult," he continued, the subtext hitting me like a physical blow. The blood drained from my face. He didn't have to name me. The entire room knew exactly who he was calling a coward. "You built something real. You didn't just stumble into it. You earned every single step. And that's the kind of man I'm happy to see starting a family." Another round of applause. This time, people actually turned to look at me. Some looks were awkward, some were filled with that nauseating brand of pity, and a few, like Uncle Rob's, were purely smug. I stayed in my seat, paralyzed by a cold, buzzing numbness. Then Nathan stepped up to the mic. I felt a tiny, flickering spark of hope. We used to be close a lifetime ago. I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd throw me a bone. Maybe he'd acknowledge his brother, or at least soften the blow my father had just delivered. But Nathan just looked out at the room, gave a humble little shrug, and smiled. "Thanks, everyone. Truly. I've been lucky, no doubt. But I also had the right role models. I saw firsthand what happens when people just give up. I saw what happened when people thought they were smarter than the system." Nathan's voice was smooth, polished, and absolutely lethal. He didn't just say it, he aimed it. He looked right at me, his eyes locking onto mine with a predatory glint, and added, "And I promised myself I'd never be that guy." The laughter that rippled through the room was awkward and strained, the kind of noise people make when they aren't sure if they just witnessed a joke or a public execution. But a few people, the ones who had always thrived on my family's hierarchy, laughed anyway. My mom beamed, her face glowing as if she'd waited an entire decade for Nathan to deliver that specific killing blow. I didn't explode. I didn't scream. I didn't even give them the satisfaction of a tear. I simply stood up. I wasn't storming out, I was just done. I turned toward the exit, my shoes clicking rhythmically on the cheap linoleum, moving past the display of lukewarm dessert. I was almost at the door when a hand clamped onto my arm. It was Jake again, Nathan's coworker. He looked even paler than before, his breath coming in short, nervous hitches. "Noah," he hissed, his voice trembling. "Wait. I need to ask you something." "Seriously?" I blinked, looking down at his hand until he let go. "Yeah." He leaned in, lowering his voice to a frantic whisper. "Is it true? Are you the guy who bought Juniper?" The world seemed to tilt on its axis. This was the moment. The exact point where the tectonic plates of our family dynamic shifted forever. I tilted my head, my expression unreadable. "Where did you hear that, Jake?" Jake glanced over his shoulder at my brother, who was currently receiving a high five from Uncle Rob. "Our boss mentioned something the other day," Jake stammered. "He said the new majority stakeholder wanted full oversight, even at the mid-management level. He said the guy bought out 51% through a private holding group, that he was young, strategic, a college dropout who ran circles around our old board of directors." I raised an eyebrow, staying silent. Jake swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "And then, when I heard your name tonight and I saw the way you carried yourself, I put it together. My God. I didn't confirm it. I didn't deny it. I just gave him a small, tired smile, the kind of smile a hunter gives a trapped animal." Jake stared at me for a heartbeat too long, the realization washing over him like ice water. "Wait," he whispered, his eyes wide with horror. "Nathan doesn't know. He has no idea." I didn't say a word. I just turned and walked out the door, leaving Jake standing there, stunned and breathless in the middle of a party that was about to become a wreckage. Outside, the cold night air hit me like a physical blow, shocking my lungs. The muffled sounds of the perfect celebration faded behind the heavy doors. I stood in the parking lot for a long time, just breathing. The weight of the evening was pressing on my shoulders, but for the first time in my life, it didn't feel like it was crushing me. They thought I was the failure. They thought I was the cautionary tale, the embarrassment they had to hide from the neighbors. They had absolutely no clue that months ago, I had quietly spearheaded the acquisition of the very firm where Nathan worked. My perfect brother was a department lead, a glorified middle manager, and I was his boss's boss. I owned the ground he stood on. They didn't know yet, but they would. That speech was the breaking point. I had a plan in motion long before that invitation ever hit my mailbox, a plan that was about to turn their curated, elitist little world inside out. I didn't go straight home. I couldn't. I didn't want to sit in the suffocating silence of my penthouse, replaying the night like a masochist watching a slow-motion car crash. So I drove. I didn't use GPS. I just let the car drift through miles of winding back roads, my knuckles white against the steering wheel as I fought back something primal and screaming in my chest. I ended up at the old overlook outside of town. Nathan and I used to bike here when we were kids, back when we were just brothers and not rivals in a twisted game of, who does Dad love more? The place looked smaller now, the trees were thin and skeletal, the railings were choked with rust. But the view remained. Our town sat in the valley below, its lights blinking like distant, indifferent stars. I sat on the hood of my car, letting the biting frost creep into my skin until my fingers went numb. I thought about them all. Nathan's smug grin, my father's glacial eyes, my mother's voice that tasted like vinegar. And then I thought about Jake's face when he realized the truth. Nathan doesn't know. It should have felt like a victory. It should have been the ultimate pro-revenge moment. But all I felt was an overwhelming, soul-deep exhaustion. It was like I'd been carrying a massive boulder for years and only just realized I could put it down. That night wasn't just an engagement party. It was a funeral for the part of me that still craved their seat at the table. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I moved through my routine like a ghost. Coffee, emails, the usual high-stakes Zoom calls. My phone was buzzing incessantly, word was traveling fast. A few board members from Juniper were pinging me, asking if I'd made a personal visit to the office. I gave them nothing but corporate speak and ambiguity. I wanted the mystery to fester. I wanted the realization to sink in slowly. Something had shifted. Not just in the company, but in the very fabric of who I was. The dropout was gone. And the man who replaced him was ready to collect the debt. For years, I had been sprinting on a treadmill that wasn't even plugged into reality. I was building, grinding, and bleeding into my work, fueled by this pathetic, lingering hope that if I just climbed high enough, the people in that rented VFW hall would finally have to crane their necks to look at me. I thought if my bank account had enough zeros, my mother's voice would finally lose its edge. That night at the party didn't just hurt. It performed a clinical extraction of that hope. It killed the version of me that craved their seat at the table, and in the wreckage, I found a cold, terrifying kind of freedom. But the weeks that followed were brutal. The success high wore off, and the emotional crash hit me like a physical illness. It started with skipping meals and ended with me ghosting the world. My apartment, usually a minimalist sanctuary of productivity, turned into a tomb of my own making. Laundry piled up like white flags of surrender. Dishes grew film in the sink while mail from investors collected dust by the door. I'd open my laptop, the blue light stinging my eyes, and stare at the code editor for an hour without typing a single character. Feature launches, user growth metrics, seed round valuations. It all felt like watching a movie in a language I no longer spoke. I was technically functional, but the pilot light had gone out. The absolute rock bottom wasn't a dramatic meltdown or a cinematic breakdown. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I was lying fully clothed on my leather couch, the TV muted and casting flickering shadows against the ceiling. I hadn't moved in 4 hours. I felt like a ghost haunting my own skin, watching the ceiling fan spin in endless, pointless circles. There was no fight left, no fire, just a vast, hollow nothingness. But rock bottom has a weird way of clearing the vision. It isn't a pit, it's a floor. It's the place where everything decorative gets stripped away and you're left with the structural truth. And my truth was this: I didn't need their approval. I never did. Their perfect metrics for a successful life were a trap I had willingly walked into. The climb back up wasn't a montage. It was a series of microscopic wins. Wednesday morning, I showered and made the bed. That was the whole list. I counted it as a victory. Thursday, I forced myself out of the apartment. I went to a local coffee shop, not to talk to anyone, but just to exist in the same zip code as other humans. I sat there staring at a blinking cursor until something inside me finally flickered. I opened my company dashboard and saw a weird spike in traffic from small businesses in the education sector. It was a tiny data point, a minute shift in the matrix, but it was movement. I jotted a note. I felt a pulse. I started a no BS journal. No Dear Diary fluff, just one raw, unedited sentence a day. Some days, the page just said, I still hate how they made me feel. Other days, I feel invisible in my own success. But then, the ink started to change. Had a killer meeting today. A user told me our app saved them 4 hours this week. The sunset didn't feel like a funeral today. I reconnected with Theo, a guy from my sophomore year who had also dropped out to start a hardware firm in Austin. We hopped on a Zoom call that was supposed to be 20 minutes and lasted 3 hours. He told me something that became my new mantra. Noah, you're trying to win a game that they rigged from the start. So, stop playing their game. Burn the board. That sentence echoed in my skull for weeks. I thought about it every time I hesitated before a board meeting, every time I softened an email to sound more professional, to please some imaginary authority figure, and every time I caught myself wondering what my mother would think of a new acquisition. Eventually, the phantom of her voice just stopped. I leaned into the growth. I stopped trying to be the martyr who did everything myself. I hired a content team, brought in a high-level head of product, and started delegating. It didn't feel like losing control anymore. It felt like building an army. I finally reached out to the Juniper division, the Lion's Den where Nathan was currently playing corporate soldier. I requested a confidential performance audit of every department lead. No names mentioned, no personal vendettas on paper, just cold, hard data. I wanted to see if the golden boy actually produced gold, or if he was just coasting on the pedigree my father loved so much. Then, the universe decided to turn the volume up. A podcast I'd done a year ago suddenly caught fire on social media. I started getting tagged in LinkedIn threads and quoted by tech VCs I actually respected. A major YouTube channel did a deep dive profile on me, branding me the renegade investor who built a kingdom without a legacy safety net. I didn't seek the spotlight, but it found me anyway. The narrative was shifting. I wasn't the dropout anymore. I was the guy who broke the system and won. And the best part? I was finally ready to show my family exactly what happens when the failure decides to collect on the debt. And then, real people started reaching out. I'm talking about hungry young devs looking for a mentor, founders pitching partnerships, and everyday users sending me DMs to thank me for building a tool that actually solved their problems. That hit different. It meant more to me than 100 scripted family toasts ever could. I wasn't just some guy with a high net worth anymore. I was useful. I was impactful. And for the first time in my life, I actually liked the man I saw in the mirror. I didn't go on some "look at me now" tour. I didn't post a cringeworthy glow-up selfie or a "how I bounced back" thread on X. I just kept my head down, working quietly and consistently in the shadows. But the universe has a funny way of bringing things full circle. One Friday morning, the ping of an incoming email cut through the quiet of my office. From HR subject, REI Department Audit Summary. I opened the PDF, my heart rate steady as I scrolled through the data. And there it was, buried in the middle. Nathan Ellis, Department Lead. Performance score, 62%. In the corporate world, that's a Walking Dead number, especially when the company average was sitting at a comfortable 81%. I leaned in, reading the feedback from his own subordinate. The comments were brutal in their clinical precision. Rigid management style, resistant to feedback, struggles with team cohesion, and prefers top-down directives over collaboration. At the bottom, in bold red text, was the HR recommendation: place on performance review cycle. Evaluate for leadership training or potential reassignment. I sat with that for a long time, the glow of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. This wasn't some calculated act of revenge or a petty sabotage move. This was the truth, cold, measurable, and documented by the very system he worshipped. For the first time in years, a profound sense of calm washed over me. Then, another ping. A second email. From Nathan. Subject, can we talk? No greeting, no punctuation, just those 5 words. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I realized I wasn't sure what version of me I wanted him to see. Was I the kid he used to overshadow? Was I the dropout they all underestimated? Or was I the man who had outgrown the need for anything they had to offer? I didn't reply. Not yet. I knew a moment was coming, a collision neither of us could avoid, and I was going to be ready. Not just with words, but with the undeniable weight of the truth. And this time, the whole damn room was going to hear it. I left the email sitting in my inbox for nearly an hour. Part of me wanted to fire back a sarcastic, "Oh, now you want to talk?" after he'd spent the engagement party using me as a punchline. I remembered the smirk, the subtle jabs, and the way the whole family treated me like a jester they'd forgotten to lock in the attic. But the colder, steadier part of me, the part that had built an empire out of spite and code, knew better. This wasn't just a message. It was the first thread of his life unraveling. Over the next few days, I watched the drama unfold through the digital window of Juniper's internal systems. I had access to everything. Employee sentiment surveys, efficiency reports, even inter-team communication logs. The audit I'd requested hadn't just flagged Nathan as a liability. It had opened a door, and I had every intention of kicking it off the hinges. I started with Taylor. She was the interim VP of product at Juniper and arguably the sharpest mind in the building. She was also the highest-ranking woman in the division, and someone Nathan routinely talked over in every single meeting. She didn't know I owned the majority stake in the parent group yet. To her, I was just an interested investor looking for boots-on-the-ground insights. I invited her to a coffee shop offsite. Neutral ground, no corporate fluff. She showed up in a leather jacket and jeans, looking exactly like someone who had been in tech long enough to stop pretending she had time for sugar-coated corporate BS. "I won't lie," she said, crossing her arms as she sat down across from me. "I was surprised when your assistant reached out. Most investors don't ask for face-to-face time with VPs unless something is on fire." I gave her a slow nod. "I'm not most investors." She studied me, her eyes narrow and perceptive. "No, you're clearly not." I cut straight to the chase. "Tell me about your team. Not the KPIs, not the quarterly projections. Tell me about the people." She hesitated, then let out a long, weary exhale. "I've got some of the best talent in the industry, Noah. But they're frustrated. Half of them feel completely ignored. The other half are being micromanaged to death. There's zero cohesion, and the strategy changes every time someone wants to look like a hero in a board meeting." "Because of Nathan?" I asked. She didn't flinch, but I saw her jaw tighten. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," I replied, leaning forward. She tapped her coffee cup, staring into the dark liquid. "Look, he's not evil. He's just convinced that his way is the only way because it's the way it's always been done. He's obsessed with the hierarchy." I smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Trust me, Taylor. I know exactly what he's obsessed with. He just inherited a mindset that rewards control over collaboration," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's. "You know the type. The 'I'm the smartest guy in the room' syndrome that breeds nothing but resentment and stagnation. I knew the type intimately. I'd grown up eating dinner with it every night. It was the same energy that had dismissed my first lines of code as a hobby and my startup as a distraction." I leaned in, the scent of over-roasted coffee beans hanging heavy between us. "Let me ask you something, Taylor. If you had the absolute power to restructure your department tomorrow, your way, no filters, no ego, what would you do?" She blinked, her hand freezing on her cup. The cynicism she'd walked in with flickered. "Are you seriously asking me that? Or is this some kind of corporate entrapment?" "I am dead serious." She leaned back, her eyes narrowing into sharp points as she searched my face for the catch. "Why? Why do you care how I'd run things?" I let a slow, cold smile spread across my face. "Because I think it's long overdue that someone who actually understands how this company breathes starts calling the shots." The silence between us stretched. I could see the gears turning in her head, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. She wasn't just a VP, she was a shark. She'd heard the rumors. "You're the majority stakeholder," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It wasn't a question. The hidden partner the board keeps whispering about. I didn't confirm it. I didn't deny it. I just took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. Taylor leaned forward, her posture shifting from defensive to predatory. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing today," I said, standing up. "But soon, I'm going to ask you to do something bold. Something that's going to rattle the cage of every old-school manager in that building. When I do, I need to know you're ready to lead the charge." She nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "I'm in. Tell me when." That was the first domino. It didn't just fall, it shattered. The next move was HR. I reached out directly to Karen, Juniper's senior human resources lead. Karen was a legend in the building, discreet, meticulous, and the kind of person who documented a conversation before it even ended. I had her pull the deep files, employee complaints, performance reviews, and meeting metadata. The pattern was more than just damning. It was a goddamn autopsy of a failing leader. Nathan had racked up more internal complaints in 18 months than any other lead in Juniper's history. He was smart about it. He stayed just inside the lines of company policy, so nothing ever triggered a formal H or red alert. But the qualitative data painted a picture of a man who didn't lead. He occupied. He monopolized the air in every room. He dismissed input from anyone who didn't share his last name or his pedigree. But it was a complaint from a junior developer named Priya that truly gutted me. Every time I propose a feature, Nathan says it's too ambitious or not aligned with core values. But when a senior male dev says the exact same thing 2 weeks later, it's innovative and visionary. I've stopped speaking up. Most of us have. We're just waiting for the clock to run out. That hit me like a physical punch to the solar plexus. Once upon a time, I was Priya. I knew the suffocating weight of being told your voice didn't matter because you didn't fit the mold. I knew the slow death of a dream in a room full of people who only valued status. But the difference was, now I owned the room. I owned the building. And I was about to own the narrative. My next step was the board. I handled it through quiet, private Zoom calls and encrypted messages. I didn't go in with a hatchet. I went in with a scalpel. I didn't even mention Nathan's name at first. Instead, I showed them the math. Under his leadership, Juniper's momentum hadn't just slowed, it had flatlined. Innovation was lagging, and we were losing talent to competitors at an alarming rate. Meanwhile, departments like Taylor's were hitting every KPI. I'm not looking to burn the house down, I told them, playing the role of the diplomatic, risk-averse investor to perfection. But I think a realignment is necessary to breathe new life into the structure. We need more layers of strategic oversight. Boards love words like realignment. They eat strategic oversight for breakfast. They wanted growth without the mess of a public firing, and I gave them the perfect roadmap to get there. Then I called my lawyer. Draft the proposal, I told him. We're restructuring Juniper's leadership tier starting next Monday. New positions, new hierarchy. I want a layer of strategic leads created above every department head, including the lead for the finance and operations division. You're demoting your brother? He asked, his voice neutral. No, I said, a dark satisfaction blooming in my chest. I'm drowning his authority without technically touching his title. We'll call it a lateral integration. He keeps the office. He keeps the salary. But he loses the power. It was poetic justice. We were implementing a collaboration-first initiative that placed Taylor as the strategic lead over Nathan. The golden boy would now have to report directly to the woman he had spent 2 years ignoring. But I wasn't finished. I had one last card to play, and it was a personal one. I hadn't heard a peep from my family since the party. No sorry from my mom, no we overstepped from my dad. Not even a text from my cousin Eli, who usually played the role of the family Switzerland. I was a ghost to them. Then, an email popped up in my personal inbox. It was from Leah, Nathan's fiancée. It wasn't a typed letter. It was a photo of a note scrawled on the back of a cocktail napkin, likely from some bridal planning event. I don't know the full story of what happened between you and Nathan, it read. But I think you're stronger than any of them ever gave you credit for. Just thought you should know that. Stay proud, Noah. I sat in the glow of my laptop, staring at those words for an hour. Then I spent another hour deciding my next move. The restructuring was going live in 7 days. It would be public knowledge. Nathan would see his power stripped away in a company-wide memo. I knew exactly what he would do. He wouldn't look inward. He wouldn't reflect. He'd do what he always did. He'd run straight to my parents to complain about the unfairness of the system he'd spent his life defending. I leaned back in my chair, watching the city lights flicker outside my window. The trap was set. The truth was coming. And this time, there would be no folding tables or lukewarm meatballs to hide behind. I knew exactly how they'd react. My family doesn't handle reality well. They handle narrative. They'd circle the wagons, sharpen their tongues, and cast me as the villainous betrayer of the golden boy. I needed to be 3 steps ahead. So, I reached out to the one person who could weaponize a secret faster than a leaked memo: Aunt Rachel. Aunt Rachel was the undisputed conduit of the Ellis clan, the unspoken press secretary who lived for the high of being in the know. If you told her a secret at noon, it was essentially carved into stone tablets and distributed to every relative by dinner. I invited her to a high-end brunch. Casual, friendly, completely harmless on the surface. "I've just been meaning to catch up," I said, leaning back as the sunlight hit the crystal on the table. "I've had a lot going on. New ventures, massive projects. You know how it is." She sipped her mimosa, her eyes darting over me like she was trying to calculate the cost of my blazer. She didn't know the full story yet, but she was starving for it. "That sounds busy, Noah. We were all so surprised to see you at the party." "Well, things change," I said, dropping the first bait. "Actually, I'm currently restructuring a company I recently invested in. It's been a headache. One of our department heads has been severely underperforming, dragging the whole team down with an outdated, ego-driven management style." Her eyes gleamed with the predatory light of a seasoned gossip. "Anyone we know?" I flashed a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Let's just say it's someone who once told me I'd never understand business because I dropped out of college. Someone who thinks a degree is a substitute for actual competence." Her jaw didn't just drop, it hung. I didn't give her a name. I didn't have to. I let the heavy silence fill in the blanks, watched the gears turn in her head, and then I simply stood up. I paid the check. No split, all me, and walked out. By dinner, my phone buzzed with a text from my cousin Eli. "Dude, whatever you told Rachel just broke the family group chat. It's a literal war zone in there." "Perfect. Let the rumors churn. Let the whispers bloom like wildfire in a field of dry brush." I wanted every person who had ever looked at me like I was a pathetic footnote to witness the moment the dropout they mocked became the architect of their hero's downfall. But it wasn't just spite, it was clarity. I was resetting the narrative, and the final piece was coming for Nathan's throat. The fallout happened 3 days after the restructuring went public. The internal memo had barely been digested by the staff when Nathan lost his mind. He didn't just crumble, he detonated. He stormed into Taylor's office, screaming about a power grab and disloyalty. He didn't realize my digital signature was at the bottom of the official filing, or maybe he did, and the shame of being owned by his failure of a brother was what sent him over the edge. I watched the carnage from my office 3 states away. My Slack feed was a constant stream of updates. Nathan was flailing in a sea of corporate ambiguity. He was still lead on paper, but he had zero authority. He tried to fight it. He argued in every meeting, interrupted Taylor's directives, and started CCing the entire board on manic emails trying to prove his worth. When HR gave him a formal warning to back off, he doubled down on his delusion. He scheduled an unsanctioned team bonding retreat at a luxury hotel, trying to bill it as a morale initiative. The receipt for the 5-star spa packages and the top-shelf bar tab told a different story. That was the pro-revenge moment I needed. I didn't even have to try. He handed me the shovel to bury him. I made the final call. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was just a signature on a termination of authority. One Thursday morning, Nathan Ellis received a formal notice of reassignment. He was no longer a department lead. He was no longer client-facing. He was stripped of every strategic decision. He kept the title and the salary, a soft landing for the family's sake, but his calendar was now a wasteland of administrative tasks, mandatory sensitivity training, and weekly oversight meetings where he sat in silence while Taylor ran the show. It was a padded coffin for a career that had only soared because he'd been standing on my head. Then I waited. Saturday morning, 9 a.m. sharp. My phone vibrated across the nightstand. "Mom." "Noah," she said, her voice tight and devoid of a greeting. "We need to talk. Right now." I let the silence stretch for 5 long beats. I wanted her to feel the weight of the air. "About what, Mom?" "You know exactly what. What happened to Nathan's job? What have you done?" Her voice was clipped, controlled, but I could hear the tremor of a woman who realized the house of cards she'd spent 30 years building had finally collapsed. "I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask," I said, my voice as cool as glass. "Maybe his manager can explain his performance issues better." You are his manager, aren't you?" "That's what Rachel said." "No," I corrected her. "Taylor is his manager. I just happen to own the company that pays them both." The pause on the other end was so long I thought the call had dropped. Then, in a small, bitter hiss, "Is this revenge, Noah? After everything we did for you?" "No," I said, and for the first time I felt completely light. "This is accountability. Welcome to the real world, Mom." I hung up. That afternoon, the final salvo arrived. A group email from my father, sent to the entire extended family. Subject: "Let's talk about respect." It was 3 paragraphs of pure, concentrated manipulation. It was filled with veiled phrases like family loyalty, airing dirty laundry, and how disappointed your grandparents would be. He spoke of betrayal, as if I had stolen the family silver, rather than simply letting his golden son fail on his own merits. I looked at the email, my thumb hovering over the delete button. They wanted a fight. They wanted me to grovel or explode. But they still didn't get it. I wasn't the kid at the folding table anymore. I was the one who owned the room. "Would you like me to script the final confrontation where Noah attends the next family dinner and serves them the ultimate reality check?" The irony of my father using respect as the headline for an email defending a golden child who spent his entire life stepping on everyone else was almost poetic. It was the ultimate Reddit tier delusion. I didn't reply. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a defensive paragraph or a play-by-play rebuttal. Instead, I let my silence become its own message, louder, sharper, and more damning than any corporate jargon could ever be. I simply archived the thread and went back to work. But I wasn't done. I had one more move to make, and this one wasn't for my family. It was for the people who actually mattered. 2 weeks later, I hosted a company-wide town hall for Juniper. It was virtual, a grid of hundreds of faces peering through webcams, recordings enabled, the atmosphere buzzing with the nervous energy that always follows a massive leadership restructure. We moved through the roadmap, the new collaboration-first initiatives, and the quarterly goals. Then we hit the Q&A. An anonymous message flashed at the top of the queue, upvoted by dozens of curious employees. Is it true that the majority stakeholder is a college dropout who used to be considered a failure by his family? A hush fell over the digital meeting. I could almost feel the HR directors sweating through their blazers. I leaned into the camera, a calm, genuine smile tugging at my lips. "Yeah," I said, letting the word hang in the air for a heavy beat. "It's absolutely true. I dropped out because I couldn't stand the suffocating idea of living someone else's life. I wanted to build something real, something tangible, even when the people closest to me were betting on my downfall. I wasn't handed this company. I didn't inherit a legacy. I earned every square inch of this seat. And I want everyone here to know something. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told you weren't enough because you didn't fit a specific mold, you are not alone. The story they write about you isn't the one you have to live. You hold the pen." The chat sidebar absolutely detonated. A waterfall of applause emojis, fire icons, and preach comments flooded the screen. Somewhere in the bowels of the finance department, I imagine Nathan watching that feed from the bland, mid-level cubicle his new administrative role had assigned him, seething in a silence of his own making. And yet, as satisfying as that was, the real climax came a month later. It was Thanksgiving. For the first time in 3 years, I agreed to show up. Leia had texted me directly. "You should come, Noah. Just for a little while. It'll be different this time. I promise. I didn't necessarily believe her, but I was curious to see the wreckage of the dynasty I'd dismantled. I drove back to that same suburban neighborhood, the streets lined with perfectly manicured lawns that hid 1,000 domestic wars. I parked in the same spot and walked up to the same front door where, only months ago, my mother had greeted me with a sneer. This time, she opened the door with a smile that was strained, fragile, and didn't even come close to reaching her eyes. "Noah," she said, her voice missing its usual razor edge. "You look, well." "Thanks," I replied, stepping past her. The house was different. It was quieter, the air thick with an awkward, heavy stillness. There were fewer guests this year. The gossip had clearly thinned the herd. I spotted Nathan by the fireplace, standing alone and swirling a glass of scotch he wasn't actually drinking. He looked thinner, his face sallow and pale under the flickering amber light. He didn't smile. He didn't throw a jab. He just gave me a stiff, hollow nod, the kind of nod you give to a sovereign power from a different league entirely. Leia hugged me fiercely. Aunt Rachel offered me a slice of pumpkin pie with a terrified politeness, acting as if we hadn't conspired over mimosas weeks prior. Uncle Rob avoided eye contact entirely, suddenly very fascinated by the texture of the wallpaper, while Aunt Monica muttered something about stressful politics and fled the room the moment I sat down. Dinner was a masterclass in tension. My mother's usual golden boy monologue was replaced by a short, clipped speech that lacked its typical triumph. My father barely looked up from his turkey, his broad shoulders slumped as if the weight of the respect email was still pinning him down. Then, halfway through the meal, my grandmother, the matriarch who had spent 80 years reinforcing the Ellis family's rigid standards, cleared her throat. The sound of her fork hitting the china was like a gunshot. Everyone stopped breathing. "I saw your video, Noah," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. I froze, bracing for a lecture on family dignity or a final dig at my unconventional path. But she just looked at me, nodding slowly with a look I'd never seen directed at anyone but Nathan. "The one where you talked about building something for yourself. About being enough. It was good." 3 words. It was good. From her, it was a standing ovation. It was a formal surrender. After dinner, I stood in the kitchen, rolling up my sleeves to wash my own plate. I felt a presence behind me and turned to see my mother. She looked smaller, the fire of her judgment dampened by the reality of who was now providing the family's security. "You proved your point, Noah," she said softly, her voice trembling with a mix of pride and resentment. I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes on the soap suds. "It wasn't about proving a point, Mom," I replied. "It was about being someone. There's a difference." She didn't respond. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. She finally understood that I was no longer a character in her script. As I prepared to leave, Nathan followed me out onto the porch. The autumn air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and dead leaves. He stood there for a long time, hands shoved deep into his pockets, staring out at the street where we used to play as kids. "I guess you got what you wanted," he finally said, his voice flat. I turned to face him, the glow of the porch light casting long shadows between us. "No, Nathan," I said firmly. "I got what I earned. There's a massive distinction between the two. You should try earning something sometime. It's a lot harder than just being the favorite." He looked like he wanted to snap back, to hurl an insult or an apology, but nothing came out. He just let out a long, shaky breath, turned, and walked back into the house. I got into my car, rolled down the window, and let the biting cold hit my face. For the first time in my adult life, I felt truly light. I felt free. I didn't need their praise anymore. I didn't crave their validation. I didn't even need their apology. Because the truth was, I had already won, not by crushing them into the dirt, but by rising so far above them that their opinions couldn't even reach me. As I pulled away from the curb, my headlights cutting through the gathering dusk, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror and smiled. Sometimes the sweetest, most absolute revenge isn't a grand explosion, it's simply becoming everything they said you never could be. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to drop a like and subscribe for more content like this. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I try to read as many as I can. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.